Oh, hello. So, welcome to number 7 in high school. And I'll tell you, I've really been struggling with this one. And I'm not sure why. Maybe it's just the vocabulary. So let me just back up for number 7, and you'll see all my numbers coming together later. But I just thought number 7 for high school. It's really, I think I started thinking about a very philosophical question after just coming up with, oh, 7 sins and virtues. Let's explore that. And I really took probably a good couple weeks to really try to get deeper with the concept of these, because we might be able to memorize the sins and virtues. You can take a test on them or whatever, but what they lose all meaning if we don't have dialogue around it. Maybe that's why I've struggled, because usually when I could have these conversations in class, there'd be kind of a back and forth. So this might be more awkward, but I'm just going to keep persevering and just keep going on, okay? Pursuing. Anyway. All right, so I'm just going to keep up. They're not really acronyms, but I just put up the letters for the sins and virtues, so I'll keep those up there for a minute. To see how many you can come up with on either side. And some of the vocabulary is a little different depending on which source you look up, but the sentiment is pretty much the same. So first, let's just talk about what makes a sin, because they're called the 7 deadly sins, right? And it's not that these sins will kill you in and of themselves. Wrath, oh, I gave it away. Like, anger might not kill you. It could. Road rage, we see examples like that today. But I think what I would focus on is, while we're alive, these are still the 7 deadly sins. And I consider them the 7, or these deadly sins, not because they will kill you outright, but because but because attachments to these kind of deaden our livelihood, our souls, for lack of a better word. So, and then the virtues are the counter to that. So if these things, I almost kind of like looking at sins are things that keep us away from ourselves. And then virtues, again, kind of an old-timey word, but virtues really gives us more freedom to be ourselves as an individual, which might not make sense yet, but let's see if I can try to do this on my own. Some of these may be just a complete bust. Anyway, let's look at the sins. I put pride as the first one, because the more I started thinking about pride, I started thinking that the other sins kind of follow along the line of pride. So for pride, it's like when we see ourselves really above or below other people, superior or inferior. And so if you think you're better than somebody else, why wouldn't you want to have more money? Why wouldn't you want to take advantage of somebody who's weaker than you if you think you're superior? So that's just kind of a conclusion that I drew. But pride would be the first one. Now, what would that look like today? There's plenty of examples, but like in media and things like that. But I don't know why I was thinking about this the other day. Like, taking selfies. Great, take them all you want. I was just going to ask, like, what the intent is. So, for example, if you take selfies because you want to preserve a memory, or you want to share it with somebody, if you really think about your intention, if that's the intention, that might be a little bit more virtuous than if you want to take a bunch of selfies to show your friends how much better off you are, or if you like need that to get a sense of identity. And the reason why that is a sin is because it's not giving you identity. It's showing that that you constantly have to work harder to show how much better, or that you're lowlier than somebody else because you don't have enough pride. Does that kind of make sense? See, this is where the back and forth. I'm just gonna keep going on. Lust, yeah. Again, I think when I see sins as deadly, I see them as killing off our spirit. So if we're lusting after something or somebody, then we have less freedoms to do other things. Sloth. Sloth is kind of an interesting one for me, because I was just thinking about that. which is like, oh my gosh, I didn't do this video, and I just like doing this. It's fun. But I started thinking, oh, am I lazy? And I don't think it was lazy as much as intimidation and just, quite frankly, fear for doing these videos. I have a bigger picture in mind, but actually sitting down and doing those is quite terrifying for me. So anyway, so sloth could look like laziness, but I also see, for example, people who talk about students who are lazy. I kind of take issue with that because when I see kids maybe not wanting to do a certain homework assignment, maybe it's not because they're lazy, maybe it's because they really don't see the value in, you don't see the value in the homework assignment, and I don't blame you. There's some homework assignments that I think I've given in the past that were ridiculous. I'll be honest about that. And so if students said, well, I didn't get my homework done, blah, 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 well, maybe it's not because you are lazy, but again, maybe it's because it really was a bogus assignment to just keep you busy. And so I kind of think about not only the 7 deadly sins, but what's the motivation behind them. So we've got pride, lust, sloth, envy, just being jealous over someone else's possessions, right? Greed, gluttony, and wrath. And so the counter to these, see if you can get these now, yeah? What would be the counter to this? And what would a virtue be? I've done this video a couple times, so if I'm repeating myself, sorry. I thought it was interesting that the root word of virtue means moral life and conduct, a particular moral excellence. It means force, strength, vigor, moral strength, qualities, abilities, moral strength, high character, goodness, manliness, valor, bravery, courage, excellent, and worth. And so, I don't know, out of all of that, it's just, we talk about maybe moral excellence, or worth gets kind of tricky just because it has a monetary value to it, which is okay. I'm just saying we need to just kind of expand our definitions of some of these things. So what I'm kind of suggesting, at least in high school, is you can pursue all these sins all you want. I'm not really your teacher. You can do all of these. I'm throwing out a question, which is, why would you want to or not? Is there a benefit to living a more lively sense of hood? I'm still having fun. Okay, anyway, so let's go back to the sin. So the first sin was pride. So the counter virtue would be humility, to be humble in someone else's presence. How do we do that? Like, how would you do that in school? I think sometimes I have to just kind of remind myself, like if I'm talking to somebody else, that just try to narrow the gap, that I am not superior, inferior to others. Is that humility? I don't know. It's just, for me lately, honestly, it's been just being really honest with myself and looking at my past and thinking, yeah, I did that. And I'm not so proud of that one. And that gives me, I think, a sense of shame. And so I think that, to me, leads me into that feeling of, this feels comfortable, to be honest. I feel like we have a society where it's comfortable to just know you're going to be envious of your neighbors, and that, or you're going to look at your friend walking down the hall. There's always going to be somebody who's going to be better looking, richer, smarter, more athletic, whatever it is. And I think just knowing that, and then appreciating your own sense of value, to be proud of what you do and who you are, but not to feel like you're superior or inferior to others. I think that's what creates these sins, right? You start feeling bad about yourself. It's like, oh, I'm just going to go eat my sadness, right? But it's not really the gluttony. The gluttony becomes the sin because it keeps us away from our life. Yeah? And so I keep coming back to the word freedom a lot. I just think it's freeing to not be tied to these, right? It doesn't mean that you don't feel these things or they're not around. It's just be more conscious of them, for me anyway, leads me to think I want to live more of a virtuous life. So humility, the counter to lust is chastity, and I kind of feel like chastity is kind of, I don't know, it's like, is it just me? It just feels like they just seem like, again, like these old timey words, like, oh, that's chastity, and like you, it's like the opposite almost. It's almost like, oh, if you have chastity, you're not living a livelihood, kind of thing. When self-perseverance over your body, I think, is chastity, which is freedom. Sloth, diligence. Okay, as long as what you're doing brings you livelihood and isn't bringing you down, like some bogus homework assignments. Envy, the counter to that I looked up is kindness. Yeah, and I think maybe kindness starting with turning it on ourselves, which is just, I have enough. I don't really find myself as envious of other people because it's like, I'm more than enough. The opposite to greed would be charity, and I was talking to Mr. Newsom about that. The word charity for me has a negative connotation. It's almost like it's taken on a form of pity or something like that, where maybe something like generosity. I love giving some of my time to students. Anyway, gluttony is temperance or just moderation, and the counter to wrath would be patience. So, with that being said, I guess I don't have a whole lot more to say if we don't have some kind of interaction. At least for now, could build on this. But what I was thinking about was maybe some other words for virtues, like to cultivate a sense of grace. How you would define that? I would define that as like dignity, so a dignified approach to something. I like this one, self-mastery. Self-mastery is, you might have the first impulse to say, oh, I'm lustful over something. But with the cultivation of virtues, you can say, that might be my first thought, but I think it's more important to cultivate self-mastery so that I'm not injuring other people. This one goes back to one of the other little lessons, which is propriety. And propriety is just proper behavior. Confucius is kind of big on that one. I kind of liked the one for diligence, initiative. To take the initiative over something that is going to give you livelihood. Right? That's going to take initiative on your part, which don't do anything yet. Just sit back for now. Trust me. Empathy, I think, is a empathy and sympathy, I think, have interesting connotations as well. I think I don't know that I think it's harder, what would be a good way to explain this? I feel like I can have empathy for you as a high school student because I was once a high school student and a high school teacher. So I can cultivate more empathy because I feel like in some ways I've had a similar experience to you if you're in public education. It's hard to have empathy if you don't have it on the other end. It's hard to have empathy, I think, for old people like me because it's like you can't imagine being 50. Which is totally reasonable, right? Anyway, I just think about our circumstances. I can think about being 40 and 30 and even going way back to the old-timey days. But it's impossible to think about myself 20 years from now. Because I just have no concept of it. So I bring that up because sometimes I'll hear adults talk about students and say, well, when kids are my age and when kids do this, and I get so defensive for you students, because that's what I'm talking to invisible high school students. But when I hear that, I just think that's so unfair for you to take that kind of a prideful, you see what I did there, kind of that prideful approach, which is I'm so superior because you're older. Just because you're older doesn't mean you're wiser, doesn't mean you're more virtuous. It just means you've lived longer. So that's my thought on that. I liked this one when I was kind of researching this. A sense of naivete. I started just thinking about just approaching stuff more like a child, like in my mind, just like, wow, that's so interesting. And not in a condescending way, by no means, but I just cultivate like this sense of a newness, you know, and I think that is kind of more virtuous. Like, ooh, I'm so glad that you have that fancy new car. That's really cool. It's pretty, ooh. But it doesn't mean I want it. It just means I think it's cool. Generosity, I just like that one better than charity. To just be generous with virtuous things, I guess. Okay. This one is one that I liked, but I think if I were in a real high school setting, I came up with the word indifference. Now, hear me out. Like, for example, when I think about gluttony or greed or even envy, I kind of, not that you don't care, but that you can take it or leave it. You're indifferent. It's like if, you know, put a beer in front of you, you want to drink it. But if you don't have the lust for something else and you're indifferent to it, it just means that you have other things to do. I like it, but I could see some counter to that. Anyway, I'm going to put indifference up here. In fact, I kind of like that one. Innocence kind of goes with that naivete, just a sense of it's all kind of new and kind of fun, just to be kind of a kid at heart. Patience, I just went with that one. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. And I think the biggest thing for me to counter what I think is the opposite of pride, which is considered prudence or is just wisdom. And for me, wisdom, it sounds like it should be so obvious to learn from our mistakes. Not so much. I still feel, or I'm just a very slow learner. So I'm going to keep plugging away at iSchool. This was a tough one. I hope next one's going to be a little rough too. And then it'll be smooth sailing until December. And then we'll start a whole new semester. So we'll see how that goes. So anyway, the biggest picture here are, you can break these down into 4, 3, 2, 1. I kind of like keeping a simple approach, which is if you really want to kind of challenge yourself or test yourself, just when this video goes off, recall any of the sins and virtues. And what's interesting about that is what you remember and what you don't remember is going to be what's significant for you personally. Does that make sense? For example, if the only one you can think of is wrath, maybe that's a good one to start with. Because you might be really angry, right? And so again, it's not that you're not going to be angry. It's just, is there tools that you can use to cultivate more patience so that you don't get so angry that you create more problems in your life, which gives you less freedoms? I hope I'm making sense. I feel like in the classroom I might be better, but anyway. And then I kind of like just coming back to these philosophies of my own. Does it have to be either or? Are you either a sinner or a virtuous person? If these are the deadly sins, are you either dead or alive? Are they the 7 lively virtues? Anyway, does it either or? Because sometimes I feel like we do get into that thinking, like if I'm not this, then I must be bad. And so it can be either or, but I don't think that would be helpful. Is it all or none? Does it have to be all of the sins? Are you a good sinner if you just fail on 1 or 2, for example? Or is it just none? Or is it more or less? can, just by thinking about what kind of life you want to start to create within this environment, do you want this more or this more? I think personally, I've leaned to the left of the board here a little bit too much in my life, and I can see where that has created wounds. Yeah, and then I just maybe I don't think it's too late to start. Do you? I'm just gonna try to start to live a more virtuous life. What's really funny about this, when I think about talking to students, I get kind of fired up. What's really funny about this is, so I've kind of, my life has just been kind of a social experiment these last couple of years, and I'm just having so much fun. And in trying to pursue a virtuous life, because as a philosopher, it's kind of a natural gravitation towards it. But what's funny is I'm finding how hard, how challenging it is. It's almost becoming comical. The more I try to actually cultivate these, the more resistance I seem to get. And I can maybe give some examples later, but okay, I did it. I think I did. Okay, so today's lesson number 7. Which would you do? Which do you want to pursue more? Again, it's up to you. You can absolutely do this. I'm just presenting. Maybe there's some counter. Yeah. Okay. Ciao for now.